Right. Thank you.
Okay, folks, I think we'll begin. Thank you all for showing up for the school seminar. Today we'll hear from one of our very own, Dr. Cyril Grueter, who anchors the primatology part of the biological anthropology part of the School of Humans, the Department of Anatomy, Physiology, and Human Biology, and the School of Human Sciences. Isn't that fun? I'm not going to go through Cyril's bio. He's been here long enough that most of us know him, but I do want to mention that some academics have expressed some concern or some hesitation about giving these school seminars because they are worried about talking about their students' work. Cyril has now had 4 intrepid women who worked in Africa complete their PhDs. And what I want to point out, I don't know how much you're going to talk about their work and your own, but the point is that the academic can pull the larger picture together. So while we have students who can talk about the details of their own work, the larger project and questions that come out of the synthesis is perfectly fair game. So I would encourage other academics to do it as well. Cyril is, like some of us, avidly waiting for multiple borders to open up to be able to continue field work. But he's had, like I said, 4 women who have completed their PhD doing the field work and one who's in that process. So we are very lucky to have such a productive researcher with us. So I'll hand over to Cyril.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for the introduction. All right. So I have to stay close to the lectern so that my fans online can hear me. All right, so let's get started. So for those of you who don't know me, my research interests really lie at the interface of primatology, behavioral ecology, and biological anthropology. And one area of research that I've been quite active in is this one here, the evolution of primate and human sociality. But I'm not going to talk about that today. There's another strand of research that I have focused on in the last decade or so, and this is about how primates have adapted to marginal environments. And I'm particularly interested in how they cope with the demands of living in high elevation environments. And when I say adaptations, I really mean behavioral adaptations. So when you think of primates, you probably think about lush tropical rainforests and savannas. And indeed, most primates are confined to the tropics, where they live at low to mid elevations in a variety of different habitats. But some primates have colonized the temperate zone, and some of them live in high elevation areas. And these are the ones that I'm interested in. So here's a few examples of primates that live at high elevation in both the tropics and the temperate zone. For example, this is a yellow-tailed woolly monkey. Then you've got the mountain gorillas that you will hear more about later on, the Synopnosis in China, and these Nepal and Kashmir Hanuman langurs. Let me just minimize this. Yeah. So high elevation environments, they are characterized by low productivity, low primary productivity. They obviously are at a high elevation. They are characterized by complex topography. They're highly seasonal in terms of resource availability, and they're also at least seasonally cold. So I'm mostly interested in behavioral adaptations. I've already mentioned that, and here's a few things that we have looked at. For example, their feeding ecology, their space use, their spatial cognition, thermoregulation, nesting behavior. And we're also planning to look at some physiological adaptations and genomic adaptations, but we haven't really done anything in this space yet. And studying behavioral adaptations of primates to high elevation environments is also really important when it comes to predicting how they will respond to things like climate change. So we do have a good justification for doing this research, I would say. So I've used different approaches to tackle that main question. On the one hand, I've done some comparative analyses. For example, we did one paper on feeding strategies. We did one on fruiting and flushing phenology. So these are comparative projects that I've done with collaborators, but I'm not going to go into these papers today. What I want to do today is to focus on single species studies. So I've done quite a few studies on primate species living in these particular environments. And that's what I really want to do today, to focus on those species. And here's my 3 model organisms, so to speak. First, I want to talk a little bit about the black and white snub-nosed monkeys in China, and I will specifically focus on their foraging strategies. These are data that I collected during my PhD, but I have recently reanalyzed some of those data. So there's something new in there as well. And then I'm going to talk about mountain gorillas. And the specific question that I will address here is, why do they sometimes venture into high elevation areas? And these are data that I collected during my postdoc, but I'm actually still in the process of analyzing some of these. That means that was a very productive time for me. And then lastly, I want to talk about a project that we launched in 2016, which focuses on behavioral adaptations of chimpanzees to a montane environment. And this is the project that has involved, as Deborah mentioned, several PhD students in this department, in this school. All right, let's start with the snubnoses. So I spent about 18 or 20 months studying these primates in China. And the overall aim was really to understand how they are able to cope with an extended period of very, very limited resource availability in a high elevation, cold environment. So let me first say a few words about the study site before I go into the predictions and the results. So the study site is located in a nature reserve called Baima-Xueshan Nature Reserve in Yunnan province. And this is really the eastern edge of the Himalayas. Some of these mountains in the background, they're almost 6,000 meters high. And as you can see from this picture here, the terrain is very, very rugged. The slopes are very steep. And this is a picture of our original research center, so to speak. It was very basic. It was just a wooden cabin at the edge of the forest. There was one fireplace in the middle and two pallets to the side, and that's it. And after a couple months of living under these very basic conditions, the nature reserve completed the construction of a proper research base. So it was actually quite comfortable living there. So this house was located in a village just outside the nature reserve. So I basically followed my study subjects for 20 months, and I established contact with them on an average of 12 days per month. As you can imagine, it was not easy locating them in this vast, rugged landscape. My study group used a variety of altitudes. They went sometimes down to the valley bottom at 2,600 meters, and sometimes they went up to, to the top of some of these peaks here at almost 4,000 meters. And the climate was highly seasonal. Winters were generally very dry, and at least at night, they were, the nights were very cold. And the summers, they were quite warm and very humid, and they were humid because of the summer monsoon winds. The lowest recorded temperature at the site was minus 12 degrees, so it did get freezing cold at night in winter. And the study site includes a patchwork of different vegetation types. So if you move up along this altitudinal gradient, you can see there's evergreen broadleaf forest here at the bottom, and pine forest. And as you move up, there's oak forest and mixed deciduous broadleaf forest. And at the highest elevation, there's fir forests and alpine meadows. So quite a distinct, this stratification of vegetation types that's quite distinct. And the forest is dominated by evergreen conifers and oaks and rhododendrons. So these trees made up 70% of the biomass at the study site. But interestingly, none of those trees were actually used by the snub-nosed monkeys as food sources. And there was very strong seasonal variation in food availability. Here you can see the availability of fruits and young leaves, two of the preferred food items for the snub-noses. And as you can see from this phenology graph here, if you look at winter, which is December to February, so there's a prolonged period here where there's no young leaves available, and there's very little fruit available in the forest at that time. So the snub-noses face a lean season for fruit and flush at the same time. And this is the total home range of our study group. It was roughly 50 square kilometers. That's really very large by primate standards. So we took a GPS location record of our study group every 30 minutes to calculate the home range. And in terms of actually, conducting the research, initially my study group was not habituated, so I observed them from a distance. I basically copied Jane Goodall in my research approach at the beginning. But then when data collection proper started, the group was semi-habituated, and I still continued conducting my observations through a telescope, usually at a distance of about 50 meters, sometimes up to 500 meters. But sometime I was able to approach the animals to within about 10 or 20 meters. And there were only very few individuals in the group that I could individually recognize. There were over 400 individuals in the group, so that was quite a daunting task. And I used, as I said, I used a spotting scope to record their behavior. I did scan sampling, so I basically scanned the whole group and I recorded their behavior and also their social interactions. All right, so something theoretical now. So let me first talk a little bit about foraging strategies. So when a primate faces a dwindling food supply, for example, in winter, it has basically two options. It can either engage in a high return strategy, or it can follow an energy saving strategy. So the high return strategy would be to invest in traveling and incurring a higher energetic cost to acquire a sufficient quantity of their preferred foods. Alternatively, they may follow an energy saving strategy where they modify their diet by switching to lower quality fallback foods and showing a corresponding decrease in moving. So what kind of foraging strategy would we expect in the case of the Synopnosis? Well, I've already shown you that in temperate environments, resources are virtually, profitable resources are virtually absent in winter. So a high return strategy would not be an option. They can't really track preferred resources because those preferred resources are simply not available in winter. So then we predicted that they would follow an energy saving strategy. And here's the specific predictions that we came up with. First of all, we predicted that they will rely more on readily available fallback resources in winter. Again, since there's no fruit in the forest and there's no foliage, their preferred food resources are absent, so they will have to switch to some sort of fallback food. And then we predicted that their day journey length should be shorter in winter and during lower temperatures. Travel probably represents the single most important expenditure of non-basal metabolic energy, and especially going up and down those steep hills is energetically very costly. So when it's cold out there, they should cut down on travel to reduce heat loss. And then we predicted that their time spent feeding should go up in winter and also with lower temperatures. And this increased feeding time will probably allow them to compensate for the lower quality foods that they consume in winter. And lastly, we predicted that the group would stay at a lower elevation in winter, sorry, and that's obviously to escape the cold conditions. So this slide here shows the percentage of different foods in the diet in different seasons. And you can see that in autumn, they eat quite a lot of fruit, and in spring, they eat quite a lot of young leaves. But the main food, their staple food throughout the year, is actually lichens, which is an unusual food resource for primates. So they basically feed on all major plant parts whenever they become available in physiological cycles, and when they're not available, they switch to lichens. So lichens are essentially what we call a fallback food. They became the dominant food item in winter when fruits and young leaves were not available. They're readily available throughout the year. And this is the operational definition for fallback foods. It's foods whose use is negatively correlated with the availability of preferred foods. And if you look at lichens, so this is the consumption of lichen, and this is the availability of preferred foods. And you can see there's a very nice negative correlation here. So when preferred foods are less available, they eat more of their fallback food. So why did they not feed on evergreen leaves in winter? You know, things like oak leaves, which are quite abundant in the forest. Well, the reason they avoid those is because they're not very palatable. They are usually, compared to deciduous leaves, those evergreen leaves, they're quite, thick and leathery, and they contain chemical defenses in the form of tannins. So switching to evergreen leaves in winter is not really an option for the Synopnosis. And then why don't they feed on conifer needles, which are also abundant at the study site? Well, same story here. Conifer needles are heavily defended by tannins, and they're also very rich in fiber, so that makes them very poor choices of food. So that's probably why they chose lichens as a fallback food and not conifer needles, because lichens are nutritionally more interesting. So here's some of the advantages of lichens as a fallback food. So first of all, they are widely and year-round available. Almost 80% of the trees that we sampled were covered with lichens. They're relatively easy to harvest. All you have to do is just grab them. You don't need any extractive foraging to get lichens. They're rich in non-structural carbohydrates, which provides them with digestible energy for thermoregulation. And they're also good sources of water. In winter, it's generally very dry. There's hardly any precipitation in winter. So lichens are a bit like a sponge. They absorb liquids, and so they're a good source of water. But there's also a problem here with relying too much on lichen. And the problem is that lichens have a very slow, where's the cursor? Lichens have a very slow regeneration time, and they're highly susceptible to air pollution and climate change. So this raises some concerns about the long-term survival of these primates, because they're so heavily dependent on the resource that responds to environmental change. All right, so the next prediction was that their day journey length should be shorter during lower temperatures. And you can see that's the case here. I've plotted mean temperature here and day journey length on the y-axis. And there's a positive association here. Again, travel is energetically very costly, so they should cut down on travel in winter in order to reduce heat loss. And then I predicted that their day journey length would be shorter in winter, and that's also the case here. You can see that in winter, they reduce their daily travel distance compared to the other seasons. So that prediction was supported. And then I also predicted that their time spent feeding would increase in winter and with lower temperatures. If you look at the graph here on the left, you can see that this is the percentage of time they spend feeding. And there's a very clear difference here between winter and all the other seasons. So they increase the amount of time spent feeding in winter. And there's a very nice negative association here between temperature and feeding time. Again, that supports the prediction that we had at the beginning. So when the temperature is relatively high, the amount of feeding is lower. And when the temperature is relatively low, the amount of time spent eating goes up. Okay. And then the next prediction was that the study group would stay at a lower elevation in winter to escape the cold. But in fact, if you look at this graph here, they stayed at the highest elevation in summer. That's not very surprising because in summer it's generally very warm, so you can stay up there. But contrary to the prediction, the lowest recorded elevation was not in winter, it was actually in spring. So we didn't find support for that prediction. And again, intuitively, we would expect them to descend to lower elevations in winter as a response to the dropping temperature, especially at night. It's really cold out there. But they remained at a fairly high elevation in winter. So, well, we try to understand, what's driving that pattern. And then we looked at the distribution and the density of their main food, lichens. And you can see that lichen density is clearly associated with elevation. At higher elevations, there's simply more lichen available than at lower elevation. And that's probably the reason they stay at a higher elevation in winter, because there's more of their fallback food up there. And then I explored the ecological correlates of elevation use a little bit further. So here I used a Bayesian hypothesis testing paradigm, and the data support a model with temperature and lichen consumption as explanatory variables for the monkey's altitudinal ranging. So if you look at this table here, so this is the preferred model with temperature and lichen. There's quite a bit of posterior mass on this model here. And so that basically means that the data support this model. And if you look at this last column here, this is the base factor, which basically tells you how much more likely this model is compared to a null model. And the model with lichen consumption and temperature predicted the data 6 times better than the null model. So that means there's reasonably good support for temperature and lichen as drivers of elevation use. And I've also plotted the data down here, and you can see that both the percentage of lichen in the diet and the ambient temperature do seem to correlate with elevation use. But I should also mention that on occasion, during very inclement weather conditions, such as heavy snowfalls and snowstorms, the study group actually did move down into the valley with higher temperatures and shallower snow depth. So I remember once when a really heavy snowstorm hit our study site, we observed our group moving down from about 3,500 meters to about 3,000 meters in just a few hours. So they really tried to escape extreme weather conditions. And there was one heavy snowstorm that caused a lot of habitat damage. 240 big trees were destroyed at the site, and many of these were actually important food trees for the monkeys. And we found 3 dead juveniles in the snow. So snowstorms can be an important source of mortality, both for the trees and the consumers. All right, so let me wrap up this part of my talk before I move on. So in conclusion, the Synopnosis exhibit an energy conserving foraging strategy, and they rely on readily available fallback resources in winter. So that's when the costs of thermoregulation were high and when the availability of preferred foods was low. And this strategy may currently be adaptive, but as I said, with global warming and with increasing air pollution in China, that main fallback food that the Synopnosis rely on may become, may dwindle in terms of availability, and that may place severe constraints on the monkey's energy budget and activity budget in the future. So this is clearly something that needs to be monitored. In order to safeguard the survival of these primates, we need to monitor their food resources and how they respond to those environmental influences. Right, let me take a sip of water. All right, let's leave China behind and travel to the heart of Africa, or more specifically to the Virunga volcanoes. So this is a satellite image of the Virunga volcano. So this is essentially a protected area that is shared by 3 countries and 3 national parks. So we've got Volcanoes National Park here in Rwanda. We've got Virunga National Park here in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then we've got Mugahinga National Park here in Uganda. And you can clearly see the boundary between the protected area and the surrounding agricultural fields. So this is actually an older satellite image. If you look at satellite images from now, they look a little bit more dramatic than this one, even more dramatic than this one. And so this is where the endangered mountain gorillas live. Some of you probably know that they were first habituated to humans by Diane Fossey, who dedicated her life to studying and protecting these gorillas from poachers. And she was tragically murdered in her cabin at Christmas in 1985. And I had the privilege of following in her footsteps and working at the Karisoki Research Center that she founded back in 1967, which is now managed by the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund. So mountain gorillas, they live in a huge salad bowl. They mainly forage on stems and leaves of ground plants and vines. They don't really eat any fruit except blackberries sometimes. So they're largely herbivorous. And again, there's a mosaic of different vegetation types that you can align along an ascending altitudinal gradient. So most of the time, the gorillas frequented this area here, the Hogenia and Hypericum woodland. That was their preferred vegetation type. But sometimes they ventured into high elevation areas. They went up to the subalpine zone and the alpine zone. So tracking the gorillas in this terrain was obviously very challenging, as you can imagine. So at high elevation, there were these deep, whoops, where's the cursor? There's these deep ravines that we had to cross that was quite dangerous. And the gorillas had this preference for hiding in these very dense blackberry thickets. And, you know, following them through that thicket was almost impossible. I mean, they were impenetrable, those thickets. So without my helpers in the field, that would have been a very difficult mission indeed. So we reasoned that some plants up there in the alpine zone must be nutritionally extremely attractive for the gorillas. Otherwise, they wouldn't go up there, right? So when they go up there, they put themselves at risk of hypothermia. So they must have a good reason to go up there. And we try to narrow things down, and there's one micronutrient that is obviously very critical for key physiological processes, and that's sodium. And we know from other animals that a sodium deficit can cause animals to go out of their way to obtain it. So, for example, Western gorillas or Western lowland gorillas, they are attracted to these swampy clearings or bays in Central Africa, where they forage on sodium-rich aquatic plants. And this guy's actually wading in the water. Yep. And elephants in Uganda, for example, they use their tusks to quarry sodium-rich rock deposits. So different animals have come up with different strategies to satisfy their cravings for sodium. So we predicted that the gorillas may go up there to satisfy their sodium requirements. So the aims of this study was to understand the dietary attractiveness of plants that grow up there in the high elevation zone. So we measured sodium content in all important food plants. We quantified sodium intake, and the prediction was very simple. It was just that sodium intake should be higher when the gorillas are in the Afro-alpine zone. So how did we quantify sodium intake or food intake in general? We did 30-minute focal observation sessions of females. We only collected data on females. It's not that the males are not interested in, but you know, we were particularly interested in food competition, and that's the domain of females. Females compete more over food, whereas males compete more over females. That's the socio-ecological background here. So we counted the number of food units that they ate during feeding bouts, and then we measured the weight of food units. And then we collected food samples for sodium content analyses. And we dried the samples using a food dehydrator, you know, that machine that turns grapes into raisins. And then we determined sodium content using an atomic absorption spectrophoto something. And in order to measure food intake, we also had to define what actually constitutes a food unit. For each plant, we had to do that. For example, a food unit can be a rhubarb stalk, or it can be a single blackberry, or it can be a handful of vines. So this is what we were able to observe, the number of food units that an individual puts in its mouth. This was obviously a very demanding protocol. Visibility was often very low, and reliably counting the number of food units that they ate was quite challenging. All right, so here you can see the results. Here you can see mean intake rate of sodium per vegetation zone in grams per hour. And you can see that when the gorillas are up there in the alpine zone, their sodium intake rate is much, much higher than when they are in all the other vegetation types. In fact, the gorillas obtained 80% of their sodium when they were at high elevation. So clearly, sodium may be a driver for using those high elevation areas. Here you can see the sodium content of all major gorilla food plants. And interestingly, you can see that the species that is richest in sodium is eucalyptus. And eucalyptus is obviously an exotic species. It only grows outside the park. Sometimes the gorillas exit the park to raid eucalyptus plantations. But of all the plants that grow inside the park, the ones that were also extremely rich in sodium were these lobelias and senaceous that grow at high elevations. This plant here near the bottom, Gallium, that's a vine. This is the top food species in the gorilla's diet. That one makes up almost 40% of their diet. But as you can see, gallium is extremely low in sodium. It's actually 90 times, it contains 90 times less sodium than this lobelia up here. So when the gorillas are up there in the subalpine and alpine zone, the foods that they go after are these two, the lobelias and the senaceous. And what they usually do is they break open the stems and then they extract the pith and they feed on the pith. And it's actually, the pith of this senaceous is actually quite tasty. It tastes a bit like dried coconut meat. It's really not that bad. I've often snacked on that. And we also did vegetation sampling to confirm that these two plants, the lobelias and the senaceous, actually grow at high elevations. They were significantly more likely to be encountered at high elevation than at lower elevations. So to sum up this second part of my talk before I move on into the last part of my talk, so we found that the commonly eaten gorilla food plants inside the park contain low levels of sodium. The only exceptions are those lobelias and senaceous that grow at the upper altitudinal limit of the gorilla's habitat. And these ones are exceptionally rich in sodium. So the take-home message here would be that the gorillas go up there to boost their sodium intake. All right, and then in 2016, as I've already said, we started a systematic study of a chimpanzee population that lives in Nyungwe National Park in Rwanda. And Nyungwe is different from many other chimpanzee study sites because it lies at a high elevation, it has a low primary productivity, it has very steep terrain, and it's relatively cool. The mean temperature is only about, the mean annual temperature is only about 14 to 15 degrees. And the chimps in Nyungwe, they go up to nearly 3,000 meters above sea level. So the overarching goal of this project is really to understand how the chimps have adapted to these high elevation environments. We know very little about these high elevation chimps. They're much less known than the lowland chimps. And I mean, understanding these parameters, you know, what sorts of resources they use, et cetera, is also important for conservation planning, obviously, because this is an endangered species. And hopefully we'll be able to share some of these results with some of the conservation organizations as well. But as Deborah said at the beginning, our fieldwork has been interrupted because of COVID and the border closures, but hopefully we'll be able to go back to the field sometime next year. And there's another reason why we're doing this. I mean, understanding chimpanzees live in a variety of different environments. So with this project, we may be able to answer the question of whether local environmental variation can influence behavioral patterns. So we do see some intraspecific variation in terms of behavior among chimpanzee populations, and some of that intraspecific variation may be related to environmental differences. So Nyungwe contains the largest population of chimpanzees in Rwanda, and our study community, the Mayebe community, is reasonably well habituated now. And so far we have identified 67 chimpanzees at the study site. I should mention, so this is Sam Green, who did her PhD on the Nyungwe chimps, and her partner was very good at you know, identifying chimpanzees and you know, cataloging their morphological features and everything. There's probably a few more chimps at the study site in the community, but it's difficult to ID all of them, especially the females that can be quite shy. So I just want to give you, in the next 5 to 10 minutes, I just want to give you a general overview of some of our main findings. Most of this work was done by my former PhD students, J.O. Matthews and Sam Green. So first we did a paper on their feeding ecology. We know very little about the feeding ecology of chimpanzees in montane forests. So we used observational data from scan sampling to examine how seasonal variation in fruit availability influences their diet. But we also collected fecal samples, we analyzed some fecal samples, and we inspected some feeding remains as well. So here's just a summary of the main findings. We found that food abundance and consumption peaked during the major dry season. So this is the dry season here, May, June, July, August. So this is when food availability is at its highest. We found that THV, which stands for terrestrial herbaceous vegetation, was an important fallback food. So they ate more of it when their preferred food, which is fruits, was less available. We also found that figs were an important and preferred mainstay. At many chimpanzee study sites, figs are a fallback food. They only eat it when their preferred foods are not available. But in Nyungwe, they actually prefer some of the figs. And that's probably has something to do with the fact that Nyungwe is a low productivity and low diversity environment. And we also found that they ate quite a lot of flowers, which is also quite an unusual feature that may be related to living in a montane environment. And then we also wanted to know how the chimps' ranging behavior was influenced by fruit availability in this rugged montane forest where the chimps always have to balance energy gain with energy expenditure. So we used data from focal follows where Sam followed the chimps from morning till evening whenever that was possible. And we also used phenology data. And we found that the chimps in Nyungwe have a really large home range, more than 40 square kilometers. That's very large by chimp standards. And we found that the chimps decreased their daily travel distances during periods of fruit scarcity. So if you look, I'm not sure if you can see that, but if you look at this table here, that's again a Bayesian analysis that I did. This is the model with fruit availability. And this model explains the data 100 times better than the null model. So that means there's very strong support for this model here. But interestingly, while they decreased their daily travel distance during periods of low food availability, they did not decrease their foraging area when food availability was low. Instead, they shifted their home range location in relation to the elevational distribution of food resources. And you can see that here, their home ranges shifted from month to month. So they were basically tracking the foods that they preferred. And there was one species here, this is East African yellowwood or Podocarpus latifolius, and this is one of their preferred foods, but that species only grew at high elevation. So when the chimps were heavily feeding on this species, they ranged at the upper elevational limit of their home range. So they were clearly tracking their food resources. And then in another paper, we looked at whether landscape features, whether the topography can influence the movement of the chimpanzees. And we found that the chimps repeatedly use the same routes and that there's a network of high density routes here. So these are like chimp highways that they frequently use. So those blue lines here, the thicker the line, the more frequently a route was used by the chimpanzees. And interestingly, if you look at this map here, so the red lines here are trails made by humans, and the most intensely used routes by the chimpanzees occurred on human-made trails. So the chimps frequently used human-made trails, but they also established their own trail network outside that of human-made trails. And this would be the blue lines here. So they made use of human-made trails, but they also had their own network of trails that they repeatedly used. And we recently published a paper entitled Chimpanzees Use Least Cost Routes to Out-of-Sight Goals. So here we looked at their ability to take landscape features into account when they plan their daily foraging routes. We know that some wild animals can recall the location of food trees and they can use straight line distances between them. But we don't know, or we didn't know, if animals can use the knowledge of the physical landscape to choose the path of least resistance. And that should be particularly important in a montane environment where movement costs are exacerbated. So how did we do that? So first, we developed a detailed GIS surface map of the home range of the chimpanzees. And then we used that GIS map to assign an energy cost of travel through each pixel. So for example, dense thickets were costlier than open forests, and slopes were costlier than flats, and human-made trails were the least costly of all. And then we basically used that cost surface map to, we overlaid the cost surface map with 160 travel routes that ended at a fruit tree. And then for each route, we basically came up with 3 different options. So the first option, so these are the models that we used. The first option was the local knowledge model. You can see that here. In this model, the chimpanzee always takes the easiest next possible step. So in this case, the chimpanzee is avoiding going uphill. That's all it does. In this model here, number 2, this is the least cost model. The chimpanzee chooses the route that entails the least energy costs. And the third model that we tested is the straight line model, where a chimpanzee just walks in a beeline straight to its food resource. So we wanted to know which of these models, there's a couple more here, the Brownian and the topological one that we didn't test, so I'm not going to go into these. So we wanted to know which of these models explains the choice of daily foraging routes. And we found that the least cost model here, number 2, performed better than the straight line model and the local knowledge model across all parameters. You can see 2 examples here. The actual path is in red, the least cost path is in blue, and the straight line path is in black. And you can see that the least cost model was a very, very good predictor of the actual path. So the chimpanzees seem to use least cost routes to their destinations. And what does this tell us about their cognitive abilities? I mean, that indicates that the chimps have a very good mental map, a very accurate and detailed mental map of their home range landscape. And they seem to have information about the energy costs of using different routes. So that's the conclusion from this study. And the last thing that I want to mention, there's a couple of projects that we are doing at the moment that are still in progress. So this is Natasha Kutz's work on the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome may also help primates to adapt to marginal habitats. For example, it may facilitate the digestion of low quality foods. And Tash is also looking at a chimp population in a forest fragment. So she's comparing chimps in the main forest, which is still reasonably intact, to a chimpanzee population living in a small forest fragment. And then another PhD student of mine who can't be here today, he just recently started working on his PhD, that's Rob Hemsworth. And he's interested in nesting behavior or behavioral thermoregulation. We know that chimpanzees build a nest every night, and that nest basically provides a stable, comfortable sleeping platform for the chimps. It protects them from the elements, it protects them from parasites, it protects them from thermal stress, from predation, etc. But we don't really know anything about the thermoregulatory properties of chimpanzee nests in high elevation environments. So he's planning to look at these questions here. Which environmental factors influence nest site selection? And if nest architecture reflects insulation, then we would predict that overnight weather conditions should influence nest architecture. So he will be looking at things like nest thickness and to see whether that correlates with ambient temperature. We're still a bit worried about some of the feasibility of some of these things, but hopefully we'll figure it out. And this is another project that we may do at some point. We know that the chimps in Nyungwe sometimes raid the crops of the local farmers. But we don't really understand the motives for these excursions outside the park. One possibility is that the chimpanzees forage on human crops when there's less fruit available inside the forest. And obviously understanding their motives for going out of the park and raiding crops is very important for mitigating human-wildlife conflict. And this is another project that we may attempt at some point. We know very little about material culture in this population, and by material culture, I essentially mean tool use. We know that adverse ecological conditions, for example, resource scarcity, can be a very strong driver of innovative behavior, such as tool use. And as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of innovation. We would predict that the chimps in Yungwe are more tool savvy than chimpanzees in lowland forests, simply because they have to cope with these ecological challenges of finding sufficient food. So they may rely more on tool use than chimpanzees in lowland forests. And this is a picture that Sam Green took. You can see a chimpanzee in Yungwe using a stick to extract honey from a tree hole. And this is my last slide. Sorry, I went a little bit over time. At some point, we may also start looking at some genomic adaptations and physiological adaptations. Maybe there's something in the genome that is indicative of adaptations to high elevation environments, maybe something that allows them to cope with crappy food resources at high elevation. It would also be really interesting to look at physiological adaptations and what determines their energy balance. We can't use Shane's data loggers, unfortunately, because these are endangered chimps. But what we can do is some non-invasive stuff. For example, we can determine urinary C-peptides or fecal thyroid hormones. So these are good markers of energy balance. So this is another project that may take place at some point in the future. All right, so this brings me to the end of my talk. There's so many people that have contributed to all this research, so many funding agencies. And I would also like to thank you for coming today and listening. Thanks. Questions?
Comments, folks. I'll go ahead.
So really nice public talk. I just want to sort of ask a few questions about the microbiome.
Yep.
So microbiome, there's quite a lot of data out there in humans, particularly that influences the immune system, particularly gut microbiome. And I just thought whether or not you could some of the other links that the gut microbiome might have on potential behavior as well. But there's quite a lot out there in the context of how the gut microbiome particularly influences the immune system.
Yep. This is really a question for Tash. So maybe if you want to jump in, feel free to do so. I mean, Tash is not only looking at ecological correlates of the gut microbiome, she's also looking at the social root. For example, the chimpanzees living in the smaller forest fragment, they obviously have, they face a greater population density, so they may bump into each other more often, so that those social interactions may also influence their gut microbiome. It is really a multidisciplinary problem. It's not just one variable that we can, that we can extract that determines the gut microbiome, right?
Yeah, you pretty much summed it up.
Okay.
So, yeah. So yes, you can definitely look at the way gut microbiome influences the organism, but we're actually looking at it as how the social dynamics and community amazing that you were saying, but I just want to do
Do you store all the samples? Because you know the short-chain fatty acids is one way things like that can be samples. That's known to influence, for example, immunological parameters and things like that. And so,
and we store it in, I mean, I still have records.
Deborah?
I just have a question on your sodium story. Did you look at anything else? I mean, what makes you think it's sodium and not some other?
Yeah, I have two answers here. So the first one is we did have a look at the literature and we found all those examples of animals doing crazy things, to get sufficient sodium. So why would a gorilla go up there to a very high elevation where they, face the risk of what's the word? Facing thermoregulatory problems, being hypothermic. So we reasoned that may have something to do with sodium, but we also looked at a number of other micronutrients. We looked at, I think 5 or 6 different micronutrients, but there was no difference between the high elevation plants and the low elevation plants in terms of, those other micronutrients. The only micronutrient that we didn't look at was iodine. So I'm not sure if that could be a driver of high elevation use, it's rather unlikely. I mean, the data clearly show how extremely rich those montane plants are in terms of sodium. So I think we have good reasons to suspect that this is what's driving it. But you're right, there may be other micronutrients that could also play a role in this. Yeah. Han.
Thank you very much, Cyril. That's a very nice talk. I really like your way to focus on the two continents, Africa and Asia. And I know you have done a lot of work on that the chimpanzees in Africa. Also have done lots on that Synopnosis monkeys, golden monkeys in China. So I wonder whether you would have some kind of a future plan focus on the African colonies, and at the same time the Asian colonies. So what kind of the differences of similarity in terms of evolution, or specifically the natural adaptation or environmental selection, what kind of it? Because that's whether such as the golden monkeys, in winter about 90% of the four-stalk food is for the lichen. That's really unusual.
Very unusual indeed, yeah.
I wonder whether, because if you look at the colonies in Africa,
yep,
and compare, that would be very interesting.
In fact, there is a population of colobines in Africa that also eats a lot of lichen,
yeah,
and that's the Ruwenzori colobus monkeys in Nyungwe National Park. And I had a PhD student, Deborah and I supervised a PhD student a while back, who focused on these colobus monkeys. And she was interested in understanding also how they cope with limited resources, and also how they can form extremely large groups. So there's an interesting socio-ecological convergence between the snub-nosed monkeys in China, which live in extremely large groups and feed on lichens, and the Ruwenzori colobus in Africa, which also form supergroups and also eat lichen. So we believe that
the difference is the proportion.
The proportion
is quite different.
Not too different. There were a couple of months when the colobus in Nyungwe really quite heavily relied on lichens. So to us, it looks like lichens are what allows them to form these large groups. It's the ecological precondition that allows them to form large groups. There's also mature leaves in Nyungwe that are actually quite nutritious, more nutritious than mature leaves, let's say in Yunnan. Those mature leaves, the evergreen leaves, they're very crappy in terms of nutrients. But the ones in Nyungwe, they're actually quite nutritious. So it looks like there's something in the environment that allows them to form these large groups. Phylogeny. Yeah.
But also some specific development after they arrived 60 million years ago.
Yeah.
High mountain, Himalayas.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite a different. It would be very interesting.
Yeah, there's been quite, as you obviously know, there's been quite a bit of work on that in Asian colobines, but much less work on African colobines. Yeah, and I agree with you that the phylogenetic history of some of those African colobines would be really, really interesting to understand better. That is a little bit outside my area of expertise, but some of my colleagues are looking at that.
Any questions online?
Are there any questions online? If anyone has a question online, just let us know. Tom, yeah.
Got a behavioural one first. Is there any sort of known correlation between altitude and poaching that might influence the movements?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, are you specifically talking now about the snub-nosed monkeys in China, or the chimpanzees in Rwanda, or the gorillas?
This one more relevant.
Yeah, I mean, poaching is still a problem in the Virunga volcanoes where the gorillas live. There's still poachers who set snares in the forest. And I mean, they know where the gorillas go. So they usually set the snares where the gorillas have a higher likelihood of encountering them. In Yunnan in China, there's been massive deforestation at lower elevations and a lot of human farming and also poaching. And it's very reasonable to believe, that those human encroachment activities have push the snub-nosed monkeys to higher elevations. Poaching is much less of a problem now than it was in the past, when those snub-nosed monkeys were actively hunted for their pelts, for food, etc. Human encroachment is also a bit less of a problem now because the Chinese government has established a number of nature reserves and national parks, and there's better law enforcement now than in the past. But yes, I agree with you. You know, if they stay at higher elevations, they're obviously safer. They're less influenced by human disturbance, poachers, farmers, etc. But there's still, you know, there's people collecting mushrooms in those forests. There's people herding their cattle. They use those meadows in the summer for you know, cattle grazing. So there's still a bit of you know, encroachment going on. Did that kind of answer your question? Yeah.
My other question was relating to the sodium idea and how much, well, really, how much do we know about other non-human primate kidneys? Because with a lot of other mammal kidneys, they're really different in how well they can either retain water or dump sodium. So marine mammals are really, really different. Some of them are really good at concentrating in urine, others are really not, but they live in the same place. And they're still mammals living in salt water. But then, so in terms of a reverse problem, is there some sort of known difference in adaptation to primate kidneys, like other non-human primates?
To be honest, I don't know. The assumption was that the gorilla kidney works similar to the human kidney. Whether there's any fine-grained differences in, you know, the inner workings of the kidney of a gorilla compared to a human, I wouldn't know. There may be something in the literature, but I would have to look into that.
It might be worth looking at.
Yeah.
There's quite big differences even with different species of seals. They've got really large gradients.
Right.
How well
Yeah.
they can concentrate urine.
Oh, thanks for the feedback here. Yep.
What's this thing of getting convective pressure in the nation of all these different species behind? Here we were focusing on one species.
Yep.
But were they foraging against, were they sharing that niche with other animals? And even in the context of the mountain gorillas, were the other species that were moving up in the mountains to get that survival system?
With the gorillas, we don't know of any other animals in the Virunga volcanoes that use those high elevation areas for sodium acquisition. No one's looked into that. I mean, there's plenty of other mammals that share the habitat with the gorillas. You know, there's buffaloes, although the buffaloes usually don't go up that high. And there's some small forest antelopes as well. With the, are you specifically talking about the gorillas now, or also?
No, across the different species, for example, lichens that was exploited
during
winter season by that species of monkeys. I was wondering if the other
species
that were also competing.
Very good question. The snub-nosed monkeys, they share part of their home range with rhesus macaques, so they live sympatrically at the same site. But they have somehow come up with, you know, a strategy to have different niches. The snub-nosed monkeys tend to live at slightly higher elevations than the rhesus macaques. And the rhesus macaques, in winter, when there's little food available in the forest, they do crop raiding. The snub-nosed monkeys have never been observed to raid any of the human crops. So they have developed different strategies, you know, to cope with reduced food availability. On the one hand, they try to, there's this stratification by elevation, snub-nosed monkeys at higher elevations, rhesus macaques at lower elevations. And then there's differences in terms of the use of human crops.
Is there a reasonable size difference between the macaques and the snub-nosed?
The snub-nosed monkeys are a little bit larger than the macaques. I mean, they are folivores, and folivores tend to be larger than frugivores on average. Yeah.
I just wondered if it related to an energy cost in moving forage for human food.
In what way?
Well, I'm not sure of the distances, but if you're climbing up, you can only go so far.
Yeah.
It costs you a lot. But if you're traveling along the ground, and at periods you might have to do that at great risk or speed, then that might cost a smaller animal less than like.
Right, yeah. I mean, there's so many factors at play here. I mean, the rhesus macaques, they're more terrestrial than the snub-nosed monkeys, which are more arboreal. So a lot of long distance movement, you know, by the macaques is done on the ground. And they're always closer to the park edge, so that it's easier for them to actually enter those agricultural fields than for the snub-nosed monkeys. And size, as you said, also plays a role here. It's difficult to really get an accurate measure of energy expenditure. I mean, you can use proxies such as daily travel distance and, you know, use of, you know, you can incorporate the topography as well, because that also influences energy costs, yeah.
I think we better
Yeah.
stop it now,
Yeah.
but at the time you can talk to Cyril afterwards, I'm sure.